rendering in charcoal. It's a very simple process. I try and make everything simple and intuitive. I try and take the theory out of it. Later, I layer in theory. I love theory, but I don't start there. So I'm going to show you my intuitive process for doing that. And I try and create a process of whatever I'm doing in art that isn't radically affected by the medium. There'll be a certain nature of materials issue depending on the medium, wet oil, dry charcoal, three-dimensional sculpture and stuff. But generally, I'll be thinking the same way for the same reasons. So let me show you that process. So here we go. So we're going to replace that with that so you guys can see the reference there. And I'll put this over here out of the way. Okay. So I'm going to use alpha color. It's these guys here. Conte sticks, anywhere from an HB to a 2B. I like HBs a little better. You could even use an H. 2Bs are a little crumbly for me, but anywhere in there. The Bs are softer than the H's. I'll use a stump, which is just a pencil made out of paper, and then you smear on, and oftentimes smear on pigment so I can make the strokes, and this will be for fine detail. I use my finger a lot. Sometimes I'll use paper towels to scrub in the detail. And then the paper is Strathmore 400 series. And it's Bristol, which means it's not super rough and it's not super smooth. It's somewhere in between. Real rough, then you're fighting the surface. And you can see maybe, well, it's a little off you can see down here, the texture of this kind of cardboard cover is real rough, and that texture fights the gradation. It destroys a realistic gradation. So I want a surface that's fairly smooth so I can get nice buttery strokes. And then you can be real painterly and loose. I like to really dig in and scrub it in. So I'll do a lot of scrubbing with my fingers, like I said, paper towels, stumps and stuff, so that I embed the pigment into it. And that's how I get kind of these rich buttery tones. And if you could see it in reality, I scrubbed it so much that the fibers, the cotton fibers of this nice paper raise up. And it feels a little bit to me like the pores of the skin if you look up close to the skin. So I like that. It feels more skin-like. In that sense, it's more photorealistic, although I'm very stylized in the way I work. And then I'm thinking of the simple architecture of the figure, the structure, which means the three-dimensional form in the right position, leaning, tilting, and facing. And then the fluid energy, the life energy, which is the long axis curve, the watery quality. And we'll notice that contours are watery, realistically or stylized. And the whole design, notice the highlight here. Whole design is watery. Notice the whole spine. It wobbles, but also the whole trajectory is going up and then curving to the left. And that flow gives that sense of life. It's a visual metaphor for the watery design. And the shadows stay dark, the light stayed light, and I make sure that they separate well. And that gives us that structure, that chiaroscuro, light and shadow rendering that gives us the biggest bang for our buck. Value is the most powerful. The dark against the light is much more powerful, almost always, than the warm against the cool color or the intense color against the gray color. Value is number one. So if we can get the values right, we can carry that value of charcoal into a full color painting and it will anchor it. And then the other thing I want to try and do, and by the way, you can use this very expensive paper, which is whatever it is, I don't even know anymore, $8-10 a sheet or something like that, probably. And it's a big double sheet of it for that, but still expensive. Or you can just use marker paper and a pad, which is actually what's underneath here. And that's a nice paper too. And actually this isn't marker paper, but you can get them in pads of marker paper. And that's cheaper, and that's super smooth. A lot of visual development artists use it, marker artists use it, designers use it because it's slick and smooth, but it's still a good quality paper that gives you can take a little abuse, gives you beautiful, rich, buttery tones. So I'm just going to pick this back out. Let's make sure I'm on camera here with this. And I'm going to draw this in, whether it's a 5 or 10 minute construction drawing, or it's going to be a beautiful, bigger than life 8 by 10 foot. I've worked several times, oil painting. I'm going to start the same way, so I'm not changing my technique and changing my thinking depending on the scale, the medium, any of the other parameters. In that sense, I think of us all as visual philosophers, where we have a view of life, and we're not going to change our philosophy depending on the setting of where we're speaking about it, depending on how much time the lecture circuit gives us to talk about our ideas. We'll have a consistency throughout. And so that's what I try and do in my processes. So this becomes my process. And I'll even show some of these construction lines in the finish sometimes. I'll draw some of these, chasing a contour or constructing the volume, the simple volume over the form, or whatever it is. And oftentimes, as I'm drawing or painting, I'll make a choice that I decide is not the best choice. Or sometimes I'll flat out put the wrong choice in, knowing I've got to fix it. And having to move things around and make the other choices kind of mixes up my process and makes it more exciting. But what I'm going to do, once I've got a basic construction here, we'll basically just work in the torso a little bit. Make sure, looks like everybody's good there. Now what I'm going to try and do is use what I call box logic. I'm going to take all of the world of values that we see in the real world or some conceived world, an infinite number of possibilities between light and shadow, from white to black. And I'm going to break it down just to 2 values, a 2-value system. And there'll be 1 value for the light side, all of the light side, and a second value for all the shadow side. And then if I have the time and the inclination, the 2-value system will become 2-value ranges. I'll have a range of lights in the light side and a range of darks in the dark side. And I'll make sure that overall they separate. And the more dramatically I separate them in general, the more we get this box logic. If we can make the shadow side a dark value or a range of dark values that's distinctly different than the light side that's a value or a range of light values, we'll get this box logic, because that's what we see in the real world. Now, if there's local object differences, dark hair, costume, then each one will have a 2-value range that might be different than the next. But within the flesh, we're going to have a light side and a shadow side. You can see the light side and the shadow side for the hair, as abstract as that's put in, is a different value range than the flesh. But within this, there'll be just 2 values. That'll be a box logic. If I make the shadows the same value or the same value range as the lights, it'll flatten it. If I make them distinctly different, it'll turn it. And then that value range can do a lot of things. But if I put a range of value as the dark shadows become the light lights in those darker halftones, then it will round the corner. So our box can get more ball-like or more tube-like, and then we can roll those over. But even if I'm drawing a very strong egg, I'll play that 2-value system, and then I'll just soften the edge. And the way I use this charcoal is I draw the 2 sides of the form in the construction or whatever stage. And then I'm going to draw the shape of the shadow on the form. Just going to take my alpha color. I'm going to make it really dark. It's a nice thing about the alpha color. It's a real black. Now I've just loaded up that paper with a good chunk of dark. And because it's not a cheap paper like newsprint, but a paper that's beautiful fibers that can take a beating, now I can take that, all that loaded up charcoal that's on the core shadow, and notice that I'm really working it, scrubbing it. And anytime I want a gradation or blending, I'm just zigzagging. And if I tighten up those zigzags, it'll end up being quite quickly a quite rendered value, quite rendered value range even. And if I need to, I'll load it up again. And I'll go down in value, filling it in that. If I have to, I can even glaze over it. But oftentimes I'll go over this several times, scrubbing that into the surface and getting the light side separating from the shadow side. And I'll oftentimes just let it go off into the background. It's going to end up being over that dark arm too. And oftentimes, since I'm a brown school artist like Rembrandt, the background's oftentimes dark. And then once I've got that, I can go on to the next form, or I can come back and keep working this form. There is my rib cage. And since I love active nudes as opposed to passive still nudes, laying on the couch, standing on the beach, I'll oftentimes draw several lines. And I'll look for great artists to give me permission to do whatever I want to do. And Pontormo, in his drawings, would be putting several lines, trying to find where the nipple is, where the contour is. And I loved the fact that he left those lines there. And so I do the same thing, and that shows a sense of energy to me, kind of vibration, like they're not quite holding still, like a double image in a photograph. And then at any time I'm ready, I can then take what is left of that pigment and blend it back into the halftone to turn it back. And oftentimes when I'm doing the halftone, I'm going to key the halftones to the highlights. So if I want to do highlights here, I'm going to have to make sure the halftone is darker than the white paper. So when I have a highlight, I can come back and get that highlight to pop out of that. So oftentimes we'll key that halftone down so it sets me up for the highlight. And notice I'm although it's a fairly quick process, I just take my time. And now I've turned this whole form I'm using the Conte to draw the final contours, and we're kind of rushing the process, but that's okay. And now I've got two sides of the form, shape the shadow on the form. What was a boxier idea is now starting to roll over because of that, the gradations around the edges. But notice I just did two sides of the form, shape of the shadow on the form, give the shadow a dark value, and then soften the edge a little, which is a micro gradation or a full gradation. And then go on. The reason I do two sides of the form is because we're going to end up having more body parts down here probably. And let's just make it a weird snowman. More body parts up here. And so then I'll come down, I'll draw two sides of this form, shape of the shadow on the form, give the shadow a value, soften the edge with a little micro gradation, or give it a full blended gradation, getting the biggest possible shadow shapes on the biggest possible forms. It can be painterly, it can be beautifully rendered. We can do that with the biggest forms or the smallest forms. And then I can go down to the next form as I did here, or I can keep working across. Well, let's go ahead and get the spine. And the spine is overlapping. The shadow of the spine is overlapping the lower back. Two sides of the form. And notice how now we've got a bit of a shotgun barrel, although it's pretty sharp. This is more curved. And if I want that to be less of a sharp, kind of like a sharp, we'll round it off, then I just zigzag and soften that. And now I've softened the corner. And I can keep finding ever smaller forms. Maybe a little bit of the base of the trapezius. If it's a little area, little form, my fat fingers are too big. Maybe the ribs against the erector muscles of the spine. I can do a gradation over the whole. I can do a little micro gradation, which is just a soft edge at the edge of the shadow. I can do a full gradation to turn that whole form and show that beautiful transition from shadow back to light. And each one of these forms, here is the rib cage, one side against the other, all the way across. And then we've got the rib cage like a shotgun barrel. See if that's on. This is on. Where the rib cage buckles in as barrel meets barrel, and every time the barrel turns to the left, it gets darker. Every time it turns to the right, it gets lighter. When it quickly turns to the right, it gets lighter quicker. When it slowly turns to the right, so it is here, it slowly gets lighter. And each one of these, this little form here, is also working against that far side. This is also working against that far side. It's also working each of those, this to this, this to this, this to this, this to this, on and on and on. They're all finding another side, two sides of the form, shape of the shadow on the form, give the shadow a shape. And then I could gradate the whole thing darker as it goes down towards the hips and lighter as it goes up towards the shoulders. Where I don't want pigment, say at that pinch of the hip against the leg. I erase it. And I can take a little duster to get the little goobers of the eraser off there. And I just keep working back and forth, back and forth. If it's a big square footage, I can lay in a bunch. And since I'm so aggressive with the use of the pigment, I'm really scrubbing and spreading. I can keep correcting that because I'm taking what was super dark and then I'm spreading some of that pigment into other areas. And lightening it back up with whatever tool I want to use. It can be any tool I want. So I could come over here and notice I'm taking pigment off the page, lightening that up. And I'll just go back and forth, back and forth. I get the effect, the range I want. So you can see it's fairly quick. And I'm just thinking of tubes and balls and boxes. So each of these things, no matter how I draw it, I'm thinking of it as a box, even though that's an egg. And then it becomes an egg when I gradate the shadow back into the light some bit. It starts as a box and it becomes a tube when I gradate it back in. Back and forth, back and forth. And you can see how it could be much more painterly, as some of Sargent's are. And this was my version of Sargent. I looked at Sargent to kind of cobble together this style. And he'll be, oftentimes, not always, sometimes he'll be very refined, but he'll oftentimes leave the pigment on the surface and not embed it, not scrub it in as much as I'm doing here. I tend to scrub it. And then I'm setting things up for the highlights and light, making those halftones dark enough. And then I'm just blending gradations to turn the form, or blending gradations to bring the shadow back into the light around the form or over the form. So that upper hip, upper gluteal against the lower gluteal is creating a little egg in there. And most of the time I leave most of the detail, like a good Brown school artist, like a Ribera or a Caravaggio, leave most of the detail out of the shadows. So you can see it's pretty quick to break it down once you've got the constructed drawing there. And I personally keep adjusting the construction as I go. And then oftentimes I keep scrubbing away my construction. And replacing it with a better choice. And you see the construction's wandering a little bit here, so you can be more careful with that. I don't mind that. We won't have time to fix it. But I like to get things a little out of whack and then fix them, because then oftentimes the ghost of the old decision what normally might feel like a bad decision is still there. And I let the audience help me make the right choice. Especially for my action figures, the workers and the boxers and stuff, I'll have several contours there and let them all be kind of a fidgety energy of where the figure is or where it was a moment ago. I love lines, I'll do lots of line. But if you didn't want the line, then you could come in with not just the light separating from the shadow, but you could have the foreground separating from the background and do the same thing. And that creates its own kind of possibilities, because then maybe some parts of the figure separate strongly from the background and others start to get lost into the background. And then once I get to some stage around here, I'll spend a lot of time, sometimes most of the time, adding secondary little subtle things, but just playing with the big stuff. So I might play with, maybe rather than doing a little more traditional highlight, maybe I hatch that. So it's a little bit of a quiver to that. Maybe she just adjusted her pose after getting a little bit of a cramp in her hip. And there's a little bit of a shift. If we took a high-speed camera, we'd catch a little bit of that ghosting of those quick, subtle movements of micro adjustments to her position, and so on. And I'll come up with a little story that'll be an excuse to do what I want to do creatively, maybe. And I'll kind of endlessly play with these things, exactly how the foreground meets with the background, exactly how hot a highlight is. I'll also use the hard erasers, white, so that, because it's pink, if they get, especially if they get old, they can stain, and then kneaded erasers. And I'll use dirty, notice how dirty that is. That's not going to take much pigment off. So I can actually blend with the kneaded eraser. or if I need to pull pigment off, beautiful thing about these things is I can stretch and play until I get a relatively clean spot, and then I can pick out my highlight. I'll dust it down and pop it out again. And just play with those. I'll leave that and I'll come back with a cup of coffee and realize that's too busy and clean it up. Simplify it down. I'll oftentimes, in any of my rendering processes, I'll spend some amount of time, and actually a lot of time, taking things out. I'll put a lot in, and then I'll take stuff out, and then realize I took a little too much out, put more in. And I'll just get a little obsessive about how that core shadow kind of disconnects and floats a little bit. You know, I like how that's a stroke on top of the other strokes. How this is harder and then it goes a little bit and then it's a little harder again, but not as hard as it was here. It's a little soft line. Here it's settled in more. Here it's completely blended together so you can't tell exactly where light becomes shadow and vice versa. A little bit of a leak in the dam of the form. Same up here. I'll just play with those little things. Try and find a real lovely way from, in my eyes, of how to say that same thing a little differently. So I use gradation in 3 ways, basically. I'll use it to round the form, to reintegrate the shadow back into light so we see how they're connected, not just how they're disconnected. I'll use it as a drop-off of light. So as we drop down the form, maybe what is very light halftones never get super dark. The halftones get darker, and maybe the highlights themselves get darker. So by the time we get down here or here, there's no highlight at all. So the highlights themselves, maybe we blast out the top of this. Highlights get darker, they gradate, even though the highlights don't connect all the way through. Maybe they gradate like skipping stones, getting darker and darker, weaker and weaker as they go. Halftones drop throughout the form, or because the form tucks under, drops off. And then also wrapping not just over the form, but wrapping around the form. Not just over the form this way, but wrapping up the form this way. And finding another pathway to come back into the light, not across the short axis, but around the long axis, a long path around to the other side. And then once I have that kind of the mechanics of that, then I just play. And like I said, that can be oftentimes most of the work. Not getting the basic structure, but exactly how that structure manifests. exactly what those marks do, not just to show the realism, but do on the abstract level to be beautiful, unique, surprising, non-ordinary. Use kind of new age spiritual terms. I like that term for art. They use that in shamanic terminology. I like it for artists. We're trying to create a non-ordinary reality where in our world maybe there really is line when there's no line in the real world. Or the structures can defy gravity maybe and float rather than be tied by the rules of the gravitational pull. So in that sense, we're creating our own mythology, our own fantasy world. Where many of the rules are the same as the real world, but a few are distinctly different. Most of the time I'll do the same thing every other realist does, but sometimes, every once in a while, I'll do something distinctly different. And then I'll call that my style. And oftentimes I'm just stealing from the best, stealing from the people who already figured it out. But I'm not stealing everything from them. I'm stealing 5%, 2% from them. Most people make the mistake of saying, boy, I love Rembrandt or I love Sargent, so I'm going to try and do everything like them. That's a good place to start. But maybe steal what you love about Sargent plus 3 or 4 or 6 or 8 other artists. And that's the best way to stand out, because now it'll look like it's you when it's really just you cobbling together the things you love about other choices. And maybe a few little things that you came up with yourself. Okay, so